Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's NeoSystems CMMC Town Hall. Now, I'd like to introduce your host, Ed Bassett from NeoSystems. Ed?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Don. Welcome to our continuing series of Town Hall Ask Me Anything sessions on the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. My guest today is Amy Howland from Perspecta. Also joining is Wade Forbes, who's drawing the conversation in real time, and we'll send that out to folks afterwards. I do want to remind everyone that we are recording these sessions as part of our community outreach to the Defense Industrial Base. Our focus at NeoSystems as a managed service provider is primarily on organizations that are seeking certification under CMMC, and that's mostly who we have in our audience today. If you do have some questions throughout the half-hour conversation today, please send those in the Q&A box within Zoom, and I will try to work as many of those questions into the conversation with Amy as I can. I'll start with the introduction of Amy. Amy Howland is the CISO, Chief Security Officer for Perspecta. She has over 20 years of experience in cybersecurity and information assurance, including work as a CISO for CSRA, which is now part of General Dynamics Information Technology, also Blue Canopy, Avaya Government Solutions, and Ernst & Young. She has really practical, real-world experience, starting out performing ethical hacking and now running large-scale security operations for Perspecta. So with this background, Amy, I think, was likely among some of the best prepared in terms of responding to the CMMC mandate. So today, eager to hear her perspective on how CMMC fits into a well-run cybersecurity operation and what Perspecta is doing to manage their own risk as well as risks within their supply chain. Amy, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with what you're doing within Perspecta in direct response to CMMC. As the initiative has come in, it's been a little over a year and a half since it emerged on the scene. Has CMMC changed your priorities, or is it more a matter of sort of focusing processes that you already had in the works?
Probably a little bit of both. I think it definitely helped to focus. So within the whole cyber, there's the IT organization and all the projects that we have underway. And so looking at what is absolutely required for CMMC definitely helped make things front and center, help folks really understand how serious this needs to be. And honestly, having a deadline, I think, is always very helpful. Now, granted, that deadline has continued to slip to the right, but we didn't know that at the time. So I think it's really helped to make sure that we completed a lot of projects that were already in flight and perhaps look to see what new ones we needed.
So as you were getting started, as you were first seeing this emerging, as you say, maybe had a little more urgency than it has as we really start shaking things out. How did you get started? What were some of those early steps that you did as you saw CMMC in the radar?
Lots of reading, lots of webinars, just like we're doing here. I think this was all new, so new to everyone. What we did is we also did that a self-assessment, and this is before SPURS, before DIBCAC. This was really lining things up. And actually, if I remember, I think it was before they had the editable version of the CMMC controls. And so looking at where we were from a level 1, level 2, level 3 perspective, for example, seeing where we thought we were already easily compliant, where we needed to do some work. And within Perspecta, we're fortunate in that it was very well discussed, if you will, across the board, even within our executive leadership team. And we realized early on that even though these are cyber controls and relating to NIST, and it usually resides within the cyber organization and then within IT, we realized that this was really bigger than that. And I think it took a while for everyone to fully grasp it, including myself, and that it's really dependent on a lot of other organizations. And there's your physical security, your human resources, your facilities, all of the folks that if we're going to have mature processes in place that need to be documented, we needed to all work together. So those were other things we started doing and setting up those meetings and discussions early on.
That, I think, has been a revelation for a lot of people, that I think what was originally looked at as maybe I'll just overlay some security on what I'm already doing has really started to become more IT transformation, even maybe business transformation in some ways, as the maturity aspect is looking for some operational discipline that you can't do just by painting a security coat on things. It sounds like you're sort of saying that as you explored it, you saw that expanding beyond what you originally thought.
Absolutely. I think it required a lot more collaboration than maybe what had been done in the past, because when cyber owns the controls, you certainly should always collaborate with, say, physical security. But if you're in the building and you know that you're badging into the building, you're using a PIN code, there's a guard there, it's very easy to write to those controls a little bit in your own box. And so really again, it's not just, is the control, are we compliant or not? It's what's all of our processes that are in place. And so, for us to have a sketch or a semblance of how to respond to that control in the SSP is great, but it's really engaging those other folks to add more meat, making sure you have all of the right information, and making sure that what you're saying is not just about one location, for example, is how do we do this across the board from a corporate perspective?
So let me circle back. You mentioned this kind of slipping to the right schedule-wise, but not moving quite as quickly as people thought. And I think that's definitely true with respect to getting auditors out there. And there are people who believe they're ready that are like, well, can I get certified today? No, you can't. Sorry, please wait. And that's been a bit of an interesting message. But there's some people listening to that are taking it the other way. It's slipping to the right, so maybe it's not real. Maybe I should slip even further to the right. So what are your thoughts on that? I mean, is that a reasonable response to the fact that things are slipping, or should we be looking at it more like, hey, it's not as urgent, we have more time, we can do it better, or should we be maybe cautious about it?
Was well stated. I think that it would be unfortunate to not take this seriously. So I think it's slipping to the right because, well, let me say this. If you look at the timeline of what's happened with CMMC from when it came out in January 2020 to all the timeline events, from setting up the accreditation body to getting the controls out to getting the appendices, so much more in identifying the pilots. If you look at it that way, you can actually see how quickly it is moving, and what they said they would do actually occurred from when they would get the final version out. So I think it's a matter of those of us who might have been looking at this sooner thought that maybe we would have had to undergo. If I recall, we might have been looking at getting certified as early as last June. Wow, which seems kind of funny now, but at the time that was really important. So that part has been slipping, but I think, to give credit, there's so much activity that has to happen, that had to happen, that it was almost too much to happen so fast. So I think that folks really do need to pay attention, need to take this seriously, maybe take it as a gift that in fact there it is slipping, because there's a lot to do. It's not what we've all been trying to accomplish in the past, just being compliant with our NIST 800-171 controls. Do you pass or not? This is about maturity and processes, and really having a great mature program in place. So I think that the other thing is that this is a DFARS. It's an actual formal regulatory rule, right? So I think that really clinches the fact that this is real and this is happening. It's just a matter of when everything gets signed.
Yeah, good point. And it is a real rule in the DFARS today. It's an interim rule, but it's not a proposed rule. It's actually a rule today. And somebody made a comment earlier this week to me. They said, well, maybe this isn't real yet, hasn't been finalized. I'm like, I don't know. It's in the DFARS today. That seems pretty real to me. So I don't know. I don't think they're likely to just take it out tomorrow. So it's probably fair to say Perspecta, probably better prepared for CMMC as it came out than many of your subcontractors, suppliers, other folks that you're working with. So as you look across and look down your supply chain at the potential impacts of, poor 800-171 assessment score, or not getting CMMC certification as that comes out, what are the potential impacts that you see for yourselves as a prime? And then what are you doing to mitigate, those risks?
Sure. So, I think from an impact perspective, we've done a lot of communication and education internally with our business development folks, our contract and account teams, our contracts and subcontracts, and other leadership to make sure that everybody was aware of this. So there's so much, strategy in setting up partnerships for, various accounts and opportunities going forward. So what we've tried to convey is that you have to make sure that your teammates are aware of what is going on in the industry in regards to cyber, in regards to SPURS, in regards to having these controls in place. So I think I heard something at one point, and I'm not sure how formalized it is, that, if you're part of a really large team and you're the prime and you have 20 contractors, say, and one is not compliant, are you not necessarily going to get awarded the contract? And I think that's not so much a problem, but that person would not be able to play. What concerns me and what I'm constantly thinking about is, again, going back to the strategy, if you have one very strategic partner and they bring something to the table, which is the whole basis, for what you're bidding and what you're saying you can do, obviously that person, it's really important that that company needs to be compliant and have their ducks in a row. So I think that's the concern, is the communication. So what we did is we realized that, and we had a call with our supply chain early on. We sent out a couple of memorandums and basically made sure that folks were aware of CMMC, aware of, what they needed to do. We had a call, we entertained questions, and we kind of provided some avenues of where they might get some resources to help, to get them ready for the controls that they had to be compliant with.
So one of the things that we've seen is that there's not a lot of clarity sometimes amongst suppliers. They're far enough removed from the government contracting process that they don't have a lot of clarity about whether or not this applies to them or how it applies to them. The focus is on controlled unclassified information, CUI, and many say they're not sure and they can't get clear guidance. Are you getting those kind of questions from your suppliers? And if so, what are you doing to help give them an answer as far as what they should be doing in response to CMMC?
So for me personally, not so much from the suppliers. I'm getting that a little bit from subcontracts, where I think this stance is, in how to handle it, because a lot of the agency contractors or individual contractors, they just don't have CUI. And I think there's sort of the difference between what do we definitively know versus what's very unclear. And so there are certain semblance of the contractor population that just, they're individuals or whatnot. And based on what they're doing, they just don't have it. Where I'm getting a lot of other questions is, within our corporation, for example, we have different enclaves or different subnetwork areas and different subsidiary types of the company. And that's where it's, kind of unclear, especially where you're dealing with research and development networks. And I think it's that sort of catch-22, where in an R&D network, you're oftentimes working with things and doing things with malware on purpose, for example, that sort of goes against the entire premise of CUI. And so trying to figure out, do we have CUI on our network is a lot of questions where we've gone back and we've had to say, okay, do you have a 7012 clause? Do you have information that's actually marked by the government? And so those are the kind of conversations that we've relayed to our contracts and subcontracts support staff so that they can have these conversations with our partners as well.
And the DFARS 7012 clause, and then that's being enforced now with the DFARS 7019 requiring reporting of SPURS scores, right? That's being used, I think, being used as an enforcement mechanism for companies to say, hey, if it's in your contract, you need to do this. And then the question is, well, what if I don't have any CUI? What if I don't have any covered contractor information systems? So then how do you comply with a requirement that only applies to covered contractor information systems if you don't have any covered contractor information systems? Then, what's your SPURS score? What do you do? So is that, and we've heard that some primes are basically demanding those scores from their suppliers, whether they have any CUI or not. And the suppliers are not sure what to do, feel like they shouldn't have to take action, but there's the 7012 clause in their contract. Is that something that you've run into, and how do you feel those rules apply to contractors that you mentioned that or they know don't have any CUI?
Yeah, that's a great question. And sort of there's two ways to look at it. As the prime, you want to know everything, but we partner as well. And I get lots of those questionnaires. And I think I'm still, my old born and raised cyber mindset. Well, it's none of your business. And so, it's how much information. And I think it's a little bit unclear whether scores literally need to be shared or just the fact that you've entered your score. So, it's interesting because you really have to think as a company, not just for today, but for the next 4 or 5 years from now. So, you're doing business with DoD today, maybe you don't have CUI, but do you plan on continuing to do business with the DoD? And if so, you obviously have to meet at least a CMMC level 1. So you have to comply with those 17 controls. Or, you might have CUI in the future. And so obviously putting CMMC into place helps to better secure your organization, regardless of what you're doing afterwards. So I think that, going back to the partnership, I mean, it potentially puts your bid, your award at risk if from a prime perspective, right? If your partners do not comply. So I think, my response to that is look at where you are now and look at where you're going in the future. And it's probably something that if you want to stay in this, in the DIB space, you probably need to really think about that.
It's an audience question that's kind of right along these same lines. And the question is, for a company that does not currently have DoD contracts, but is hoping to get into that space, what's the recommended approach for figuring out what CMMC level they may need to meet?
Yeah, I've had a bunch of those conversations. That's a hard one because I think if you want to play, you're going to have to do the investment. So, I mean, at a minimum, right, you would start with the level 1 controls and then kind of think about what is your niche? What do you have to offer? So if you're looking to get into that space, is what you're doing something that really would have the potential to handle CUI on your own, or to partner with a prime where you would also be handling CUI. And if you think that's the case, start looking towards that level 3 and getting those controls in place. It's obviously a much bigger investment to go to 130 versus 17 controls, but that's where you have to sort of look at the opportunity cost and the risk, and what are you able to offer, and does it make sense that you might actually be handling CUI?
We've talked with a lot of companies that view it as a capability, right? That'll say kind of what this audience member is asking. We don't have CUI, but we want to demonstrate a capability. So how do we do that? And the answer is, NIST 800-171 compliance, and then CMMC level 3. And now you've got, even if you don't today have CUI, you've got a capability that you can demonstrate. The flip side of that is, if you're going to say you don't have the capability, you're sort of saying, hey, I'm not interested in that work. I'm not capable of taking it and doing that processing.
Mm-hmm. It's a differentiator too, as well. I mean, if you can talk to the fact that you're marching towards that, I think it shows where you're trying to go in the industry.
So the contracting officers specify the level at each contract, and then that flows down to the lower tiers. And what you as a prime flow down can be a different level than what you're doing. So for instance, if you're at, say, a level 4, because you're handling some very sensitive information, you could, limit what you share with your subcontractors. And we've heard with some of the primes that they're going through their list of suppliers and sort of systematically looking to reduce the number of suppliers that they pass CUI to. And there's 2 benefits of that. One is, by limiting the flow of CUI to all these different companies, it reduces the number of places that our adversaries could try to steal it from. Quite frankly, reduces the vulnerability surface. And the other is that it reduces the burden on those suppliers, right? If you can say definitively to them, hey, you can still keep doing this work for us and only be level 1, it lowers their cost, effort, et cetera. So is that something that at Perspecta, are you actively managing that? Are you looking to, to reduce the number of companies, or more analyzing the way it is today?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's not something I'm personally involved in and looking at the level of, our suppliers, but in having those same conversations with our subcontracts team, and sort of going back to the question you asked earlier about definitive CUI, I think what you're saying makes perfect sense, but it kind of goes back to the fact that so many companies either don't have CUI, that kind of goes in different directions. They don't have it because it's either it's not marked or they literally don't have it. And so that's kind of the stance that a lot of our subcontracts team is taking into place, is that it's really, with all the subs that we have, and it's certainly a fair number, they don't seem to have a lot of CUI that's been defined and marked by our customers. So I think at this point in time, I'm not aware of any particular strategy to reduce, vice the fact that as we're pushing these down, who really has the 7012, I mean, well, who really is supporting us in a manner that would indicate that they have CUI.
Makes sense. And there's one of the audience questions that just came in is, what's the best place to find the definitive list of what is and isn't CUI? And that's a tough one. So I'll say that you could look back at our catalog of, we had the gentleman from NARA, the National Archives, that set up the CUI program on one of these town halls. So search for that one maybe. Amy, do you have any references or places people could look other than the National Archives website that would help sort out what is and what isn't CUI? Any tools that you're using?
Not that I'm aware. There's the DoD procurement toolbox has some interesting information in there just in general, and that may not be a good answer for this question, but I sometimes forget about it. And it's a plethora of knowledge. It's a really great place to look. I think NARA certainly is the place to go. I agree that I think there are pieces that are very clear, and when you're looking for a certain answer, it seems like that's the time when it's not so clear. So it's not easy. We've put together a CUI handling guide internally, but that references the archives. It references the NARA website in regards to that definitive list. But really the purpose of the handling guide is all of the avenues of what to do with CUI, and there's all the formality of it. And then we sort of have an easy to use section that's, how do I email it? How do I store it? Here's what I want to do. How do I do this? So it's sort of like the easy guide place to go for that. But going back to the person's question of, what is it, that a little bit more difficult, but obviously, but it really goes back to what is your customer marking as CUI?
And we see a lot of times it's not that well marked, so it's definitely a factor. One of our helpful audience members, Jonathan Stamler, I'll call out since you were contributing here, posted a link to the dodcui.mil CUI registry, and I put that in the chat window. So yep. Grab that URL out of the chat window. One more question on this kind of this topic from the audience. He says, being that there are no certifications as of yet under CMMC, how does a prime verify or validate that their subs are compliant with CMMC or NIST, other than a self-assessment score or uploading the file to SPURS? So Amy, you had mentioned, questionnaires, and you're a little bit reluctant to share all that data with your, contractor, or excuse me, customers perhaps. How are you determining where your suppliers are? What are you asking them to self-report to you?
Oh, I have to remember specifically because I was actually involved in refining our latest questionnaire that we have, but it's the same thing as, have you submitted a SPURS, excuse me, a SPURS assessment score? Do you have, and let's see, I'll probably talk off the cuff of what, either a hybrid of what we have or what I've seen in other questionnaires. So it's, do you have a POAM? And it's not necessarily asking, I think some companies do, but we're not asking which control do you have a POAM for, but is if you have POAMs, what is the date by which you would, have those completed? I've seen questionnaires about readiness for CMMC, but much of it is, and we actually go into a lot more about just sort of the basic underlying functions of cybersecurity. If you have certain types of the program in place and policies and procedures, and questions across the board that would give a sense that your partner is actually serious in following cyber. What they need to have a mature program and moving into where they're going to not only submit a SPURS score, but that you might have some semblance of confidence that the score is going to be relatively mature.
So as we all start getting CMMC score or certification, do you think you would replace that questionnaire and that sort of evaluation process with a simple one that says, send me a copy of your CMMC certificate? Or would you still want to need some of that in-depth feel for what's going on at the supplier?
That is a great question. So I think a little bit will be coming out with the guidance of exactly what is releasable. And I think obviously with the, NDAs in place with primes and subs, you can provide that information. I know, I think Katie Arrington has suggested to not always post your score and post where you are. Obviously that's an advertisement. We don't need to get into the wrong hands. I think it would probably be a good idea to continue to ask some basic questions about the cybersecurity program. And it kind of gets into the fact that, with CMMC, maybe until we're several years down the line, we want to make sure that it's being treated as such and not going back to the old CNA, ANA, 3-year mentality of like, I have to do this and I'll dust it off. So I think knowing how you did on your assessment is great, and it shouldn't technically be a point in time, even though the assessment really is a point in time. But because of all the maturity and process requirements that CMMC is asking for, I think it really will show what you are doing from an underlying program perspective. But until we're several years down the road where that's actually in place, it's probably a good idea to continue to ask some basic premise of the cyber program.
Good enough. I'm going to shift gears. We've got just a few minutes left. I want to shift a little bit off of some of the mechanics that we've been talking about. It's a really good conversation, though. So one of the big challenges, with CMMC is raising the bar of cybersecurity across a defense industrial base of 300,000 companies. That takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of people. So on a personal note, I know that you pivoted your career from accounting to cybersecurity fairly early on, and you described it as discovering your new calling. So how do we attract and encourage more people to make a similar shift and help take up this workload that we need to make CMMC successful?
I love the way you said that, because that question, it's an important question, but the way that it's often phrased is, how do you get more people into cybersecurity? And it's an important question, but it's always asked. You phrased it as, how do we get more people to help complete this mission and support CMMC? I think that's great. I think it's a big collaboration with, I mentioned all the other interdependencies earlier, but really so much of it is between cybersecurity and IT. It's IT operations that is doing so much of the work. Cyber does, so much with monitoring and policies and standards and awareness and all of the cyber hygiene, but, we're not the ones who actually turn off split tunnel or create cyber baselines and whatnot. So it's really our IT ops teams. And when you're doing that assessment, it's the IT ops teams that are the ones that have to do the show me. So I think it's developing that trust with them, making sure that your peers in IT ops or other areas really understand the why behind the controls, so that they can help prioritize all the projects that they have and what they're doing, and really help to bring cyber into everything that they're doing. And so that's what I found, is as you have these relationships and build this trust, and folks understand why behind, why you're asking to do something, more and more of our ops folks are stepping up and including the word cyber in every conversation that they're having. And I think that's really what's important to help drive the mission to get people involved.
So I like the twist there. So instead of bringing more people into the cyber career field, it's putting cyber into those other career fields.
Both technically, but yeah.
Yeah, but that's great, and probably what it really takes, right? Making security so everybody's job. You hear people talk about that, right? Making a culture of security and making everybody think about it and bake it into their day-to-day thinking. So that's absolutely, and I think given the amount of CMMC controls that are carried out by IT personnel, I think that's absolutely the right way to look at it. So I think that's great perspective. So with just a couple minutes left, I'll just ask a wrap-up question. I always like to ask about how we can achieve better results for the effort and work we're putting forth. So CMMC, it's a starting point. We can already see it moving the needle, even though we haven't, gotten assessments going yet. The promise, as I mentioned, is raise the bar across the board, including all those weakest links that are the attractive targets for our adversaries. So what's an action that each of us should take to really maximize the benefits of this program in terms of deterring threats, right? We talk about compliance, we talk about, getting the certification, but the real mission here is to deter cyber threats. So if we want to maximize the amount of cyber threat deterrence we get out of this, what's your suggestion to us?
treat it as a program. It's not a sort of what I said earlier. We're not dusting off a 3-year, control compliance assessment. We've worked so hard to get here. If you're achieving CMMC, especially level 3, there's a lot that you've put in place, a lot of collaboration and a lot of implementation and a lot of investment that you've done. Don't stop. Keep going. Keep maturing your processes. Continuous monitoring is a standard cyber buzzword, but if you've done all this for CMMC, keep it going, keep it up, and continue to look at your processes that you have documented, mature those processes, and it's giving you a better cyber program. It's securing your company, and then, oh, by the way, you're also compliant and able to bid and receive awards. But just look at it as a program, not a one-time thing, and it will encompass everything you're doing.
That's great advice. Thank you very much. We are at the end of our half hour, so I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank the audience for some great questions and for your attention here today. I'll mention a couple of upcoming events we have. So our next town hall series, next session in our town hall series is going to be Wednesday, April 28th at our regular time of 1 o'clock Eastern. We're going to have Tony Bai. He's the federal practice lead from pending C3PAO company Align. But before that, on the 27th of April, we have a half-day second Industry Readiness Summit. This is part 2 of our industry summit that happened a few months ago. We've got a keynote speech from Suzanne Spalding, former DHS Undersecretary for Cyber and Infrastructure, kind of before CISA was CISA. We've got Edward Yu from the FBI, Mark Montgomery from the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, Chris Hughes from Rise 8, Dr. Shivankan from Google, Sean Benny from Microsoft, Brian Ware, ex number 2 person at CISA. So some really great speakers, some great perspectives coming at us from like I say, from many angles, government and industry and the vendor community. Really happy to see as much participation from the vendor community in this session as we have. So that's on April 27th, again, half day. If you don't have the registration details, you can visit our website. It's neosystemscorp.com. I also want to mention that we're going to be taking a break from the Town Hall series the first week of May. We'll resume in May 12th with legal perspective from Bob Metzger, attorney. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good day. We'll see you next time.